Gifted Hands, The Ben Carson Story, by Ben Carson and Cecil Murphy. Narrated by Right Here Audio. Chapter 7. ROTC Triumph. I was 10 years old when I first became interested in Johns Hopkins University Hospital. Back in those days, it seemed that every television or newspaper medical story involved somebody at Johns Hopkins. So, I said, that's where I want to go when I become a doctor. Those guys are finding cures and new ways to help sick people. Although I had no question about wanting to be a doctor, the particular field of medicine wasn't always so clear. For instance, when I was 13, my focus changed from being a general practitioner to becoming a psychiatrist. Watching TV programs featuring psychiatrists convinced me, for they came across as dynamic intellectuals who knew everything about solving anybody's problems. At that same age, I was very aware of money and figured that, with so many crazy people living in the United States, psychiatrists must make a good living. If I had any doubts about my chosen career, they dissolved after my 13th birthday when Curtis gave me a subscription to Psychology Today. It was the perfect gift. Not only a great brother, but a good friend. Curtis must have really sacrificed to spend his hard-earned money for me. He was only 15, and his after-school job in the science lab didn't pay a lot. Curtis was generous, but also sensitive to me. Because he knew I was getting interested in psychology and psychiatry, he chose that way to help me. Though I found Psychology Today tough reading for a kid my age, I grasped enough from the different articles that I could hardly wait for each issue to arrive. I also read books in that field. For a while, I fancied myself as some sort of a local shrink. Other kids came to me with their problems. I was a good listener, and I learned certain techniques for helping others. I'd ask questions like, "Do you want to talk about it?" or "What's troubling you today?" The kids opened up. Maybe they just wanted a chance to talk about their problems. Some of them were willing to listen. I felt honored to have their confidence and to know that they were willing to tell me their troubles. "Well, Benjamin," I said to myself one day, "you've found your chosen field, and you're already moving into it." Not until my days in medical school would that focus shift once more. In the second half of 10th grade, I joined the ROTC. I'll confess that I did that largely because of Curtis. I really admired my brother, although I would never have told him so. Whether he knew it or not, he provided a role model for me. He was one of the people I wanted to emulate. It made me proud to see him in his uniform, his chest plastered with more medals and ribbons than anybody I knew. My joining the ROTC started another change in my life, helping me to get back on the right track. My brother, then a senior, had reached the rank of captain and was the company commander when I became a private. Curtis never caught up in the peer thing and the demand for clothes like I did. He stayed on the honor roll and remained a good student right through high school. He graduated near the top of his class and went on to the University of Michigan, eventually majoring in engineering. After I joined ROTC, another significant person came into my life, a student named Sharper. He had reached the highest rank. After I joined ROTC, another significant person came into my life, a student named Sharper. He had reached the highest rank given to a student, that of a full colonel. Sharper seemed so mature, so self-assured, and yet likable. "He's incredible," I thought as I watched him drill the entire ROTC unit. Then came the next thought. If Sharper could make colonel, why can't I? At that moment, I decided I wanted to be a student colonel. Because I joined ROTC late, in the second half of 10th grade instead of the beginning of the year like the others, it meant I'd be in ROTC only 5 semesters instead of 6. From the beginning, I realized that my chances of ever making it to the top weren't very good. But instead of discouraging me, the thought challenged me. I determined that I would go as far as I possibly could in ROTC before I graduated. My mother continued to talk to me about my attitude and began to make an impression. She didn't lecture because she was discovering more subtle ways to encourage me. She memorized poems and famous sayings and kept quoting them to me. Thinking about it now, Mother was incredible memorizing long poems like Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. She often quoted to me a poem called You Have Yourself to Blame, a poem I've never been able to find in print, but it's about people offering excuses for failing to do their best. The bottom line was that we have only ourselves to blame. We create our own destiny by the way we do things. We have to take advantage of opportunities and be responsible for our choices. Mother stayed on me until I fully grasped that I am the one ultimately responsible for my life. I had to take charge if I wanted to amount to anything. Soon my grades zoomed upward again. During both the 11th and 12th grades, I ranked among the A students again. I had gotten back on the right track. Another influential person in my life was an English teacher named Mrs. Miller. She took a personal interest in me in ninth grade English and taught me a lot of extra things after class. She was proud of me because I was such a good student, and she taught me to appreciate good literature and poetry. We'd go over everything I'd done in class that wasn't perfect, and she stayed with me until I corrected every mistake. In the 10th grade, when my grades dropped, she was disappointed. Even though I no longer had her for a teacher, she kept up with me and knew that my indifference to schoolwork caused my grades to fall, because I was just hanging out instead of trying. I felt bad about it, because she was so disappointed. At that point, I felt more guilty about disappointing her than I did my mother. Finally, I began to realize that I had myself, and only myself, to blame. The in-group had no power over me unless I chose to give it to them. I started pulling away from them. The clothes issue largely resolved itself, because in ROTC we had to wear a uniform 3 days a week. That meant I had to wear regular clothes only 2 days a week, and I had enough of the right clothes that kids didn't talk about me. With my clothes problem solved, and my changed attitude, once again I started doing very well in school. Several teachers played important roles in my life during my high school years. They gave me personal attention, encouraged me, and all of them tried to inspire me to keep trying. I particularly admired and appreciated two men teachers. First, Frank McCotter, the biology teacher. He was white, about 5'9", medium build, and wore glasses. If I'd first seen him on the street, without knowing anything about him, I would have said, "That's a biology teacher." Mr. McCotter had so much confidence in my abilities that he pushed me to take more responsibility, and he provided me with extra tutoring in the biological sciences. McCotter assigned me the responsibility to design experiments for the other students, to set them up, and to keep the lab running smoothly. The second teacher, Lemuel Dokes, directed the band. He was black, well-built, and serious most of the time. Although he had a fine sense of humor, Mr. Dokes always demanded perfection. He wouldn't settle for our getting the music right. We had to play it perfectly. More than being a teacher with interests limited primarily to music, Mr. Dokes encouraged my academic pursuits. He saw that I had musical talent, but he told me, "Carson, you have to put academics first. Always put first things first." I thought that was an admirable attitude for a music teacher. As much as for his music, I also admired Mr. Dokes for being courageous. He was one of the few teachers who would stand up to the bullies in the school and not let them scare him. He wouldn't tolerate any foolishness. A few students challenged him, but they ended up backing down. I earned a lot of medals in ROTC for being a member of the rifle team and drill team. I won academic awards in just about every competition offered. Along with this, I received rapid promotion. One of the big challenges came when I was a master sergeant. Sergeant Bandy, an instructor in the United States Army and head of the ROTC unit at our high school, put me in charge of the 5th hour ROTC unit because the students were so rambunctious that none of the other student sergeants could handle them. "Carson, I'm going to put you in charge of this class," he said. "If you can make anything out of them, I'll promote you to second lieutenant." That was exactly the challenge I needed. I did 2 things. First, I tried to get to know the guys in the class and discover what really interested them. Then I structured the classes and the exercises accordingly. I offered extra practice on fancy drill routine at the end of each successful teaching session, and the guys loved doing that. Second, reverting to my earlier skill at capping on people paid off. They soon shaped up because when they didn't do things appropriately, they learned I could make them look bad by capping on them. This method didn't employ the best psychology, but it worked, and they fell into line. It was just before summer, and I'd been working hard with the class for several weeks when Sergeant Bandy called me into his office. "Carson," he said, "the 5th hour class is the best unit in the school. You have done a fine job." And true to his word, Bandy promoted me to second lieutenant at the end of the year, unheard of in our school. The promotion allowed me to try for field grade, because only after making second lieutenant could anyone sit for field grade examinations. The normal route went from second lieutenant to first lieutenant to captain and then to major. After that, few students went on to become lieutenant colonel, and only 3 in the whole city of Detroit made full colonel. Sergeant Bandy set it up for me to go up for the field grade examination. I did so well that he scheduled me to appear before a board of majors and captains in the real Army. About that time, Sergeant Hunt became the first black sergeant in charge of our ROTC unit, replacing Sergeant Bandy. Sergeant Hunt recognized my leadership ability, and because I was doing so well academically, he took a special interest in me. He'd often take me aside and say things like, "Carson, I've got big plans for you." Sergeant Hunt used to give me a lot of extra hints and suggestions, sharing his own insights into things that the examiners would want me to know. "Carson," he'd bark, "you gotta learn this and gotta learn it perfect." I memorized all of the required material. The regular Army officers who conducted the examination asked every possible question from our training manuals. Questions about terrain, battle strategies, various weapons and weapon systems, and I was ready. When I went up for the field grade examination, along with representatives from each of the 22 schools in the city, I made the highest score. In fact, my total was, at least then, the highest any student had ever achieved. To my delighted surprise, I received another promotion, all the way from second lieutenant to lieutenant colonel. Again, a feat totally unheard of. Naturally, I was elated, even more of a wonder. This took place during the first part of 12th grade. I could hardly believe it myself. From the second half of 10th grade, 10A, I had gone from private to lieutenant colonel by the time I reached 12B. I still had a full semester of school left, and another field grade examination was coming up. That meant I actually had an opportunity to become colonel. If I made it, I would be one of 3 ROTC colonels in Detroit. I sat for the exam again, and did the best of all the competitors. I was made city executive officer over all the schools. I'd realized my dream. I'd gotten all the way to colonel, even though I had joined ROTC late. Several times I thought, well, Curtis, you got me started, and you made captain. I've passed you, but I wouldn't have gotten into the ROTC if you hadn't done it first. At the end of my 12th grade, I marched at the head of the Memorial Day parade. I felt so proud, my chest bursting with ribbons and braids of every kind. To make it more wonderful, we had important visitors that day. 2 soldiers who had won the Congressional Medal of Honor in Vietnam were present. More exciting to me, General William Westmoreland, very prominent in the Vietnam War, attended with an impressive entourage. Afterward, Sergeant Hunt introduced me to General Westmoreland, and I had dinner with him and the Congressional Medal winners. Later, I was offered a full scholarship to West Point. I didn't refuse the scholarship outright, but I let them know that a military career wasn't where I saw myself going. As overjoyed as I felt to be offered such a scholarship, I wasn't really tempted. The scholarship would have obligated me to spend 4 years in military service after I finished college, precluding my chances to go on to medical school. I knew my direction. I wanted to be a doctor, and nothing would divert me or stand in the way. Of course, the offer of a full scholarship flattered me. I was developing confidence in my abilities, just like my mother had been telling me for at least the past 10 years. Unfortunately, I carried it a little too far. I started to believe that I was one of the most spectacular and smartest people in the world. After all, I had made this unprecedented showing in ROTC, and I stood at the top of my school academically. The big colleges wrote to me and sent out their representatives to recruit me. Meeting representatives from places like Harvard and Yale made me feel special and important because they wanted to recruit me. Few of us get enough experience at feeling special and important, and I was no exception. I didn't know how to handle all the attention. The school reps flocked around me because of my high academic achievements, and because I had done exceptionally well on the Scholastic Aptitude Test, SAT, ranking somewhere in the low 90th percentile. Again, unheard of from a student in the inner city of Detroit. I laugh sometimes when I think of my secret for scoring so high on the SAT. Back when my mother would allow us to watch only 2 or 3 television shows and insisted that we read 2 books a week, I did just that. One program, my favorite, was the General Electric College Bowl. On that program, a quiz show. Students from colleges around the country sat as contestants and competed with each other. The master of ceremonies asked factual questions and challenged the knowledge of those students. All week I looked forward to Sunday nights in my mind. I had already focused on another secret goal, to be a contestant on that program. To get the chance to appear, I knew I'd have to be knowledgeable in many subjects, so I broadened my range of reading interests. Having inherited a job in the science laboratory after Curtis graduated helped me tremendously because the science teachers saw my desire to know more. They gave me extra tutoring and suggested books or articles for me to read. Although I was doing well in most of my academic subjects, I realized I didn't know a lot about the arts. I started going downtown after school to the Detroit Institute of Arts. I walked through the exhibit rooms until I knew all the paintings in the main galleries. I checked out library books about various artists and was really taking in all of that material. Before long, I could recognize the master's paintings, name the works themselves, cite the artists' names and their styles. I learned all kinds of information, such as when the artists lived and where they received their training. I soon could recognize the paintings or artists like a flash when questions came up about them on College Bowl. Next, I had to learn about classical music if I wanted to compete. When I started that phase, I used to receive weird looks from people. For instance, I'd be out on the lawn digging up weeds or trimming the grass and have my portable radio playing classical music. That was considered strange behavior for a black kid in Motown. Everybody else was listening to jam and bebop. In truth, I didn't much like the classical music, but here again, Curtis played a decisive role in my life. By then, he was in the Navy, and once when he came home on leave, he brought a couple of records. One of them was Schubert's Eighth Symphony, unfinished. He played that record endlessly. "Curtis," I asked, "why do you listen to that stuff? It sounds absolutely ridiculous." "I like it," He said. He might have tried to explain a little bit about the music, but at the time I wasn't quite ready to hear him. However, he played that record so often during his 2 weeks at home that I found myself going around humming the melody. About that time I realized that I had actually begun to enjoy classical music. Classical music wasn't totally foreign to me. I had taken clarinet lessons since the 7th grade, because that's what my brother played. And after all, that meant my mother had to rent only one instrument in the beginning, and I could use Curtis's old music. Later, I went on to cornet until, in 9th grade, I switched to the baritone. Curtis helped me to enjoy Schubert, and then I bought a record as a gift from my mother. Truthfully, I bought it for myself. The record contained the many overtures from Rossini's operas, including the most well-known, the William Tell Overture. My next step was listening to the German and the Italian arias. I read books about operas and understood the stories. By then I was saying, this is great music. I no longer pushed myself to learn about classical music because I wanted to be on College Bowl. I had gotten hooked. By the time I got to college, I could listen to just about any piece of music, from classical to pop, and I'd know who wrote it. I have a good ear for recognizing styles in music, and I cultivated that. During college, every evening, I used to listen to a program called the Top 100. It played only classical music. I listened every night, and it wasn't long before I knew the Top 100 cold. Then I decided to branch out from just classical music. So I made it a point to listen and learn from a wider range of music. I did everything I knew to get ready to try out for the College Bowl. Unfortunately, I never did get to appear on the program. Gifted Hands, The Ben Carson Story, by Ben Carson and Cecil Murphy. Narrated by Right Here Audio. Chapter 8, College Choices. I stared at the $10 bill on the table before me, knowing I had to make a choice. And since I had only one chance, I wanted to make sure I made the right one. For days I'd considered the matter from every possible angle. I'd prayed for God to help me, but it still seemed to come down to making one single decision. An ironic situation faced me in the fall of 1968. For most of the top colleges in the country had contacted me with offers and inducements. However, each college required a $10 non-returnable entrance fee sent with the application. I had exactly $10, so I could apply only to one. Looking back, I realized that I could have borrowed the money to make several applications. Or it's possible that if I'd talked to representatives from the schools, they might have waived the fee. But my mother had pushed the concept of self-reliance for so long I didn't want to start out owing a school just to get accepted. At the time, the University of Michigan, a spectacular school and always in the top 10 academically and in sports events, actively recruits black students. And the University of Michigan waived the fees for in-state students who couldn't afford to pay. However, I wanted to attend college farther away. I looked hard at my future, knowing that I could get into any of the top schools, but not knowing what to do. Graduating third in my class, I had excellent SAT scores, and most of the top colleges were scrambling to enroll blacks. After college, with a major in pre-med and a minor in psychology, I'd be ready for medical school, and at last on the real road toward becoming a doctor. For a long time, it bothered me that I had graduated third in my senior high school class. It's probably a character flaw, but I can't help myself. It wasn't that I had to be first in everything, but I should have been number one. If I hadn't gotten so sidetracked by the need for peer approval, I would have been at the head of my class. In thinking toward college, I determined that would never happen again. From now on, I'd be the best student I was capable of being. Several weeks flew by as I struggled over which college to send my application to, and by late spring, I had narrowed the choice between Harvard and Yale. Either would have been great, which made the decision difficult. Strangely enough, my final decision hinged on a television program. As I watched College Bowl one Sunday night, the Yale students wiped the Harvard students off the face of the map with a fantastic score of something like 510 to 35. That game helped me to make my decision. I wanted to go to Yale. In less than a month, I not only had my acceptance at Yale to enter in the fall of 1969, but they offered me a 90% academic scholarship. I suppose I should have been elated by the news. I was happy, but not surprised. Actually, I took it calmly, and perhaps even a bit arrogantly, reminding myself that I had already accomplished just about everything I'd set out to do. A high scholastic record, top SAT scores, every kind of high school recognition possible, along with my long list of achievements with the ROTC program. Campus accommodations befitted students of my stature. The student housing was luxurious, the rooms more like suites. The suites included a living room, fireplace, and built-in bookcases. Bedrooms branched off from the main room. 2 to 4 students shared each suite. I had a room to myself. I strode onto the campus, looked up the tall, Gothic-style buildings, and approved of the ivy-covered walls. I figured I'd take the place by storm, and why not? I was incredibly bright. After less than a week on campus, I discovered I wasn't that bright. All the students were bright, many of them extremely gifted and perceptive. Yale was a great leveler for me, because I now studied, worked, and lived with dozens of high-achieving students, and I didn't stand out among them. One day, I was sitting at the dining room table with several class members who were talking about their SAT scores. One of them said, "I blew the SAT test with a total of just a little over 1,500 in both parts." "That's not too bad," another one sympathized. "Not great, but not bad." "What did you get?" the first student asked him. "Oh, 1540 or 1550 total." I can't remember my exact math score. It seemed perfectly natural to all of them to have scores in the high 90 percentile. I kept silent, realizing that I ranked lower than every student sitting around me. It was my first awareness of not being quite as bright as I thought, and the experience washed away a little of my cockiness. At the same time, the incident only slightly deterred me. It would be simple enough to show them. I'd do what I did at Southwestern and throw myself completely into my studies, learning as much as possible. Then my grades would put me right up in the top echelon, but I quickly learned that the classwork at Yale was difficult, unlike anything I'd ever encountered at Southwestern High School. The professors expected us to have done our homework before we came to class, then use that information as the basis for the day's lectures. This was a foreign concept to me. I'd slid through semester after semester in high school, studying only what I wanted to. And then, being a good crammer, spent the last few days before exams memorizing like mad. It had worked at Southwestern. It was a shock to realize it wouldn't work at Yale. Each day I slipped farther and farther behind in my classwork, especially in chemistry. Why I didn't work to keep up, I'm not sure. I could give myself a dozen excuses, but they didn't matter. What mattered was that I didn't know what was going on in chemistry class. It all came to a head at the end of the first semester when I faced final examinations. The day before the exam, I wandered around the campus, sick with dread. I couldn't deny it any longer. I was failing freshman chemistry, and failing it badly. My feet scuffed through the golden leaves, carpeting the wide sidewalks. Sunlight and shadow danced on ivory-covered walls. But the beauty of that autumn day mocked me. I'd blown it. I didn't have the slightest hope of passing chemistry because I hadn't kept up with the material. As the realization sunk in of my impending failure, this bright boy from Detroit also stared squarely into another horrible truth. If I failed chemistry, I couldn't stay in the pre-med program. Despair washed over me as memories of 5th grade washed through my mind. "What score did you get, Carson?" "Hey, dummy, did you get any right today?" Years had passed, but I could still hear the taunting voices in my head. What am I doing at Yale anyway? It was a legitimate question, and I couldn't push the thought away. Who do I think I am? Just a dumb black kid from the poor side of Detroit who has no business trying to make it through Yale with all these intelligent, affluent students. I kicked a stone and sent it flying into the brown grass. Stop it, I told myself. You'll only make it worse. I turned my memories back to those teachers who told me, Benjamin, you're bright. You can go places. There, walking alone in the darkness of my thoughts, I could hear Mother insist, Benny, you can do it. Why, son, you can do anything you want. And you can do it better than anybody else. I believe in you. I turned and began walking between the tall, classic buildings back to the dorm. I had to study. Stop thinking about failing, I told myself. You can still pull this off. Maybe. I looked up through a scatter of fluttering leaves, silhouetted against the rosy autumn sunset. Doubts niggled at the back of my mind. Finally, I turned to God. I need help, I prayed. Being a doctor is all I've ever wanted to do, and now it looks like I can't. And Lord, I've always had the impression you wanted me to become a doctor. I've worked hard and focused my life that way, assuming that's what I was going to do. But if I fail chemistry, I'm going to have to find something else to do. Please help me know what else I should do. Back in my room, I sank down on my bed. Dusk came early, and the room was dark. The evening sounds of campus filled the quiet room. Cars passing, students' voices in the park below my window, gusts of wind rustling through the trees, quiet sounds. I sat there, a tall, skinny kid, head in my hands. I had failed. I had finally faced a challenge I couldn't overcome. I was just too late. Standing up, I flipped on the desk lamp. Okay, I said to myself as I paced my room, I'm going to fail chemistry, though I'm not going to be a doctor. Then what is there for me, no matter how many other career choices I considered? I couldn't think of anything else in the whole world I wanted more than being a doctor. I remembered the scholarship offer from West Point. A teaching career? Business? None of these areas held any real interest. My mind reached toward God, a desperate yearning, begging, clinging to Him. Either help me understand what kind of work I ought to do, or else perform some kind of miracle and help me pass this exam. From that moment on, I felt at peace. I had no answer. God didn't break through my haze of depression and flash a picture in front of me. Yet I knew that whatever happened, everything was going to be all right. One glimmer of hope, a tiny one at that, shone through my seemingly impossible situation. Although I had been holding on to the bottom rung of the class from the first week at Yale, the professor had a rule that might save me. If failing students did well on the final exam, the teacher would throw out most of the semester's work and let the good final test score count heavily toward the final grade. That presented the only possibility for me to pass chemistry. It was nearly 10 p.m., and I was tired. I shook my head, knowing that between now and tomorrow morning I couldn't pull off that kind of miracle. Ben, you have to try, I said aloud. You have to do everything you can. I sat down for the next 2 hours and pored through my thick chemistry textbook, memorizing formulas and equations that I thought might help. No matter what happened during the exam, I would go into it determined to do the best I could. I'd fail, but I consoled myself. At least I'd have a high fail. As I scribbled formulas on paper, forcing myself to memorize what had no meaning to me, I knew deep inside why I was failing. The course wasn't that tough. The truth lay in something much more basic. Despite my impressive academic record in high school, I really hadn't learned anything about studying. All the way through high school, I'd relied on the same old methods, wasting my time during the semester and then cramming for final exams. Midnight. The words on the pages blurred, and my mind refused to take in any more information. I flopped into my bed and whispered into the darkness, "God, I'm sorry. Please forgive me for failing you and for failing myself." Then I slept. While I slept, I had a strange dream, and when I awakened in the morning, it remained as vivid as if it had actually happened. In the dream, I was sitting in the chemistry lecture hall, the only person there. The door opened, and a nebulous figure walked into the room, stopped at the board, and started working out chemistry problems. I took notes of everything he wrote. When I awakened, I recalled most of the problems, and I hurriedly wrote them down before they faded from memory. A few of the answers actually did fade, but still, remembering the problems. I looked them up in my textbook. I knew quite a bit about psychology, so I assumed I was still trying to work out unresolved problems during my sleep. I dressed, ate breakfast, and went to the chemistry lecture room with a feeling of resignation. I wasn't sure if I knew enough to pass, but I was numb from intensive cramming and despair. The lecture hall was huge, filled with individual fold-down wooden seats. It would seat about 1,000 students. In the front of the room, chalkboards faced us from a large stage. Also on the stage was a big desk with a countertop and sink from chemistry demonstrations. My steps sounded hollow on the wooden floor. The professor came in and, without saying much, began to hand out booklets of examination questions. My eyes followed him around the room. It took him a while to pass out the booklets to 600 students. While I waited, I noticed the way the sun shone through the small panes of the arched windows along one wall. It was a beautiful morning to fail a test. At last, heart pounding, I opened the booklet and read the first problem. In that instant, I could almost hear the discordant melody that played on the TV with The Twilight Zone. In fact, I felt I had entered that never, never land. Hurriedly, I skimmed through the booklet, laughing silently, confirming what I suddenly knew. The exam problems were identical to those written by the shadowy dream figure in my sleep. I knew the answer to every question on the first page. "Piece of cake," I mumbled as my pencil flew to write the solutions. The first page finished. I turned to the next page, and again, the first problem was one I had seen written on the board in my dream. I could hardly believe it. I didn't stop to analyze what was happening. I was so excited to know correct answers that I worked quickly, almost afraid I'd lose what I remembered. Near the end of the test, where my dream recall began to weaken, I didn't get every single problem, but it was enough. I knew I would pass. "God, you pulled off a miracle," I told him as I left the classroom. "And I make a promise to you that I'll never put you into that situation again." I walked around campus for over an hour, elated yet needing to be alone, wanting to figure out what had happened. I'd never had a dream like that before. Neither had anyone I'd ever known. And that experience contradicted everything I'd read about dreams in my psychological studies. The only explanation just blew me away. The one answer was humbling in its simplicity. For whatever reason, the God of the universe, the God who holds galaxies in his hands, had seen a reason to reach down to a campus room on planet Earth and send a dream to a discouraged ghetto kid who wanted to become a doctor. I gasped at the sure knowledge of what had happened. I felt small and humble. Finally, I laughed out loud, remembering that the Bible records such events, though they were few, times where God gave specific answers and directions to his people. God had done it for me in the 20th century. Despite my failure, God had forgiven me and come through to pull off something marvelous for me. "It's clear that you want me to be a doctor," I said to God. "I'm going to do everything within my power to be one. I'm going to learn to study. I promise you that. I'll never do this to you again." During my 4 years at Yale, I did backslide a little, but never to the point of not being prepared. I started learning how to study, no longer concentrating on surface material and just what the professors were likely to ask on finals. I aimed to grasp everything in detail. In chemistry, for instance, I didn't want to know just answers, but to understand the reasoning behind the formulas. From there, I applied the same principle to all my classes. After this experience, I had no doubt that I would be a physician. I also had the sense that God not only wanted me to be a physician, but that he had special things for me to do. I'm not sure people always understand when I say that, but I had an inner certainty that I was on the right path in my life, the path God had chosen for me. Great things were going to happen in my life, and I had to do my part by preparing myself and being ready. When the final chemistry grade came out, Benjamin S. Carson scored 97, right up there with the top of the class.